how does caffeine work to make us feel more alert? And does the timing in which we ingest caffeine play an important role in whether or not it works for us or against us? So maybe we just start with, how does caffeine work? Why is it that when I drink mate or coffee, which are my preferred sources of caffeine, do I feel a mental and physical lift?
So let's start with how caffeine works. Caffeine is in a class of drugs that we call the psychoactive stimulants. So it works through a variety of mechanisms. One is a dopamine mechanism. Dopamine we often think of as a reward chemical, but dopamine is also very much an alerting neurochemical as well. And caffeine has some role, it seems, to play in increasing dopamine. But its principal mode of action, we believe, in terms of making me more alert and keeping me awake throughout the day, is on the effects of adenosine. And to explain what adenosine is, from the moment that you and I woke up this morning, this chemical adenosine has been building up in our brain. And the longer that we're awake, the more of that adenosine accumulates.
Prior to allowing the professional to proceed, we want to briefly mention in a few seconds. Are you one of the millions of people who rely on caffeine to get through the day? It's no secret that caffeine can give us a much-needed energy boost, but have you ever stopped to consider the impact it's having on your sleep? The truth is, the effects of caffeine can linger in our bodies for hours after we consume it, disrupting our natural sleep cycles and leading to a host of negative consequences. From decreased sleep quality to difficulty falling asleep, the effects of caffeine on our sleep are far-reaching and can have a serious impact on our overall health and well-being. But don't worry, we're here to help. In this eye-opening video, we'll delve into the science behind caffeine and its effect on our sleep, exploring everything from how caffeine affects our brains to how it disrupts our circadian rhythms. Let's continue.
Where is this adenosine coming from and where is it accumulating?
Yeah, so the adenosine here that we're talking about that is creating the sleep pressure is a central brain phenomenon, and it comes from the neurons themselves combusting energy. And so as we're awake throughout the day and our brain is metabolically very active, it's accumulating and building up this adenosine. Now, the more adenosine that we have, the sleepier that we will feel. So it really is like a sleep pressure is what we call it. Now, it's not a mechanical pressure, don't worry, your head's not going to explode. It's a chemical pressure. And it's this weight of sleepiness that we feel gradually growing as we get into the evening.
As I am awake longer, adenosine is released in the brain, and my wakefulness areas are being actively shut down by that adenosine, and my sleepiness brain areas, so to speak, are being promoted to be more active. Is that correct?
That's right. And it's a very progressive process. It's not like a step function where caffeine comes into play here, because caffeine comes into your system and it latches onto those welcome sites of adenosine, the adenosine receptors. But what it doesn't do is latch onto them and activate them. It's like someone, coming into a room and you're just about to sit down on the chair and caffeine comes in and just pulls out the chair and you're like, well, now I've got nowhere to sit. And caffeine just keeps pulling out the chairs from adenosine, and adenosine, even though it's at the same concentration in your brain doesn't know that you've been awake for, 10 hours, 16 hours at that point when you've downed a cup of coffee, because all of that adenosine that's still there can't communicate to the brain that you've been awake for 16 hours.
But it's a terrible thing. But what about the person, maybe this person is me in my 20s, who says, I'm going to drink caffeine all day long, and then I want the crash, because at 9 or 10 p.m., if I stop drinking caffeine at, say, 6 p.m., and I crash, then I crash into a slumber, a deep night of sleep.
Yeah.
Is that sleep really as deep as I think it is? Because given the half-life of caffeine that you mentioned a few moments ago, I have to imagine that having some of that caffeine circulating in my system might disrupt the depth of sleep, or somehow the architecture of sleep, in a way that even if I get 8 or who knows, even 10 hours of sleep, it might not be as restorative as I would like it to be.
Yeah. And that is the danger, just sort of that, those people that you described who say, and a lot of them will speak with me too, say, look, I can have 2 espressos with dinner and I fall asleep fine and I stay asleep. Because usually those are the 2 phenotypes that we typically see with too much caffeine. I just can't fall asleep as easily as I want to, or I fall asleep, but I just can't stay asleep. And caffeine can do both of those things quite potently.
How late in the day do you think is, assuming somebody, translate this, folks, if you go to bed earlier or later, you have to shift the hours accordingly, but given somebody who typically gets into bed around 10:30 and falls asleep around 11:30, when would you recommend they halt caffeine intake? And these are not strict prescriptives, but I think people do benefit from having some fairly clear guidelines of what might work for them. Would you say cut off caffeine by what time of the day?
I would usually say take your typical bedtime and count back sort of somewhere between 10 to 8 hours is probably getting a little bit close, but take back sort of 10 hours or 8 hours of time. That's the time when you should really stop, using caffeine is the suggestion. And the reason is because for those people who even just keep drinking up until, into the evening, you're right that they can fall asleep fine, maybe they stay asleep, but the depth of their deep sleep is not as deep anymore. And so there are 2 consequences. The first is that for me, and it can be up to by 30%, and for me to drop your deep sleep by 30%, I'd have to age you by between 10 to 12 years, or you can just do it every night to yourself with a couple of espressos. The second is that you then wake up the next morning and you think, well, I didn't have problems falling asleep and I didn't have problems staying asleep, but I don't feel particularly restored by my sleep. So now I'm reaching for 3 or 4 cups of coffee the next morning rather than just 2 or 3 cups of coffee. And so goes this dependency cycle that you then need your uppers to wake you up in the morning. And then sometimes people will use alcohol in the evening to bring them down because they're overly caffeinated. And alcohol, and we can speak about that too, also has very deleterious impacts on your sleep as well.